Dr. Gilman, the one in the middle, he is an ordained rabbi. He is an ordained rabbi through the Jewish Theological Seminary, while he is now a professor of Jewish philosophy. Throughout his distinguished career as a rabbi and an academic, Dr. Gilman has been known as both a prominent figure in the conservative movement and an intellectual iconoclast. I will leave it to him to tell us more about our evening's guests. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Neil Gilman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and welcome to you all. Let me first outline the procedures for this evening. There will be two initial presentations of 15 minutes each. The first by Mr. Hitchens, the second by Rabbi Boteach. This will be followed by two 10-minute rebuttals in the same order, which will then in turn be followed by two 5-minute rebuttals. This should leave at the end approximately 30 minutes for questions from the floor, which will be screened by the Y staff and passed on to me, and I will read them and present them to our two speakers. Christopher Hitchens has written prolifically for periodicals, including The Nation, the London Review of Books, Harper's, the Los Angeles Times Book Review, Slate, the New York Review of Books, Newsweek International, the Times Literary Supplement, and the Washington Post. He is a contributing editor to Vanity Fair. He is also the author of more than 10 books, including Why Orwell Matters, The Trial of Henry Kissinger, Letters to a Young Contrarian, and most recently, The Portable Atheist and God is Not Great. Rabbi Shmuley Boteach is host of the Rabbi Shmuley Boteach Show on the Oprah and Friends XM satellite radio network. He has been named a finalist for Brandeis University's new Charles R. Bronfman Visiting Chair in Jewish Communal Innovation. That competition will be determined within the next few weeks. He is the founder and chairman of This World, the Jewish Value Network.
The whole world on the chairman. Worked.
That's what they wrote.
That's fine.
Okay. And just released his 19th book, The Broken American Male. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to present Christopher Hitchens.
Shalom. Thank you very much for coming, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Rabbi, for a very generous introduction. I don't know how I'm going to fill up 15 minutes. After all, the burden of proof is not with me. But I can probably make a... That is going to take some time, making the case. But I think I can probably make a fist of it. I prefer to argue, and I do in my book, that the belief in a supreme being or creator is actually a pernicious belief that does great moral and intellectual damage to our poorly evolved primate species. And I'm hoping that we will, in the course of this evening, get to the point about the ill effect of religion, but I'm not going to duck the obligation imposed upon me by the motion before us, which is to give the reasons why we're so lucky as to be furnished with so little evidence for such a horrible proposition. And falsity, after all, is a subdivision of perniciousness. Religion, however, does stand, having started in that pejorative manner, does in a way stand to our credit. We are, after all, imperfectly evolved primate mammals though we are, and aware of our kinship with other such creatures, we do have the gift of pattern seeking in our minds, and we will pursue this gift, often at our own expense, but at great hazard and often with great ingenuity. That has a plus side and a minus side. It very often means, you'll have observed it in your own lives and those of others, that we prefer a junk explanation to no explanation at all, or a conspiracy theory to no theory. And religion takes its place in our evolution in this precise manner. It's the first and worst explanation we came up with. It's the best we could do when we didn't know we lived on a cooling planet with big fissures in its crust. When we didn't know there were microorganisms that had power over us, we didn't have dominion over them. To the contrary. When we didn't know we lived on a spherical planet, we didn't know we revolved around other spherical bodies, everything was terrifying, new, mysterious, and often lethal. It was our first attempt at philosophy in that way, first attempt at cosmology, first attempt at geography, biology, all the rest of it. A hopeless attempt belonging to the bawling, fearful, ignorant childhood of our species, but very necessary. And it possesses still the advantage of having come first. The terrible advantage over the mind and over learning that it possesses is its originality. And the history of human emancipation is the struggle to get away from this terrifying, foolish, ignorant first try. And I can see we have still some distance to travel, but we have made a start. Now, you can argue it because it's still here. We know a little bit, of course. We don't now think that the Aztecs were really on to something. We don't think that all faith-based is better than none. We don't think you need to wrench a living heart out of a chest cavity to make the sun come up every day. We've been through the list of gods. It's in my edited collection, The Portable Atheist. Mencken actually drew up a list of very nearly 10,000 gods that used to be worshipped and aren't anymore. As my friend Richard Dawkins says, everyone's an atheist. Nobody believes in the sun god Ra anymore. Nobody believes in Huitzilopochtli anymore. Nobody believes in Juno and Venus anymore. You're all atheists as far as that's concerned, and you look with pity on those who support or ever did such cults. All we say is, make it consistent. Just go one god more, and you're nearly there. Peter de Vries puts it. Peter de Vries, who, poor guy, brilliant novelist and great essayist, who, poor guy, was brought up Dutch Reformed in Illinois, says in his wonderful discussion of religion, Slouching Towards Kalamazoo, it's called, I recommend it, people used to be polytheistic. They believed in many, many, many gods. Then, for some reason, they decided to narrow it down to one. They're getting nearer to the true figure all the time. This is the struggle I want to invite you to join, ladies and gentlemen. The easiest way, I think, to clear your mind of such remaining illusions as you may possess or labor under is the following. The great words of Laplace, the first person to develop what's called the orrery, a model of how the cosmos and the universe would look as if it was viewed for the first time from the outside, the circulation of the heavenly bodies and the planets. And he showed it to the Emperor Napoleon, who wanted to know how this great genius, the only rival to Newton in his time, Laplace, had managed this. And he demonstrated to the Emperor how it worked. And the Emperor said, but there's no God in this machine. And Laplace says, well, it works very well, Your Highness, without that assumption. Not just science, but our own other reflections have told us that there is nothing remaining to be explained that could only be explained by the existence of a supreme being, creator, or first cause. The universe, and our lives too, all operate exactly as you would expect them to if there was no such thing. Why does the delusion persist? Well, we might get to that. I think it has a lot to do with wish thinking. And not wishing only for desirable things either, such as the survival of death, but also wishing for things that are less desirable, such as the triumph of ourselves over others, with God on our side, having made a special covenant with, say, just one tribe in Bronze Age Palestine. The most reactionary idea probably ever invented by the religious. But you'll see analogies of it everywhere God is discussed. Or the need for a terrifying supreme dictator. Nietzsche is said to have said that God is dead. Freud is said to have said that God is dad. Others clearly believe that we would be better off. In fact, we wouldn't have any ideas of our own if we couldn't submit to a celestial totalitarianism, a final, unanswerable authority in the heavens. This is wish thinking, but of a very unpleasant kind. It shows again how poorly we have evolved ourselves from the fearful primate and mammalian species that first crawled out of the mire. Now, there are global and cosmic versions of this. I have time, I think, for a few minutes remaining, to deal with them both. Start with the cosmic. Why not? There are I think it's 4,000 billion observable galaxies now. Anyone who claims to know a lot about all of these has sources of information denied to me, but we know a little bit about them and a lot more than we used to do. And Edwin Hubble noticed rather famously a few decades ago that they're all moving away from each other rather rapidly. It's what they call the red light problem or observation. Very rapidly indeed, in fact. Now, this has very important implications because it was thought until 9 years ago that because of gravitational factors, that rate of expansion would surely by now be slowing. They'd still be expanding, moving away from each other fast, but less fast all the time. No, the rate is going up. The speed is increasing. Lawrence Krauss has a wonderful piece in the upcoming Scientific American on this absolutely crucial point. It means that within measurable time, there will be no signs left in the observable universe that the Big Bang ever occurred at all. Everything will have disappeared out of sight. There will be no markers, nothing to take observations from. I mention this because it's often said that how can something come out of nothing? It's the clever question every religious demagogue and businessman always begins by asking you. Well, we know we've got a bit of something in this universe, and we know nothingness is coming. So, some design, huh? Nothingness is not just innate, programmed, it's the next big thing. And we at least had some somethingness. As if to make assurance doubly sure, the Andromeda Galaxy is headed directly in collision course with our own. Measurably, it's already filling. The sky can be seen with the naked eye. In 5 billion years, which is to say fucking soon, ladies and gentlemen, it's on us. And if it hasn't happened before then, our sun goes into a red giant, then a red dwarf. We become a crisp. That'll be nothingness programmed instead of somethingness. Some design, huh? Well, let's move then, while you ponder that, to the tiny suburb in which we actually do know we live. This little corner, just our solar system. Every other rock in our solar system is completely inhospitable to life, either too hot or too cold, as is most of our planet, which, as we know, have good cause to know, is on a knife edge of climatic survival as we speak. We could become extinct at any moment. In fact, when we still lived on the savanna of Africa, the environment to which we were adapted and have fled, but where we still betray the scars of our lowly origin by the coat of fur we grow in the womb and then shed, by the appendix, by our terrible dentition, and by many other things. Our adrenal glands are too big, our prefrontal lobes are too small. We're not the finest primates that could have evolved. It's estimated by the people who've done the DNA work on this that we were down as a species to less than a few thousand because of climatic events and other nightmares and catastrophes before the decision was made to abandon the savanna and seek cooler territory. We could very easily have joined the 99.9% of every other species that has ever been in existence on this tiny planet and become extinct. That close. What are we flattering ourselves about? What is so great about our anthropic principle that we should attribute this to a design or a designer? Some design, huh? And some designer too. Who but a serf wants it to be true? Who but someone who doesn't like to do their own thinking wants or needs this to be true in the face of all, not just some, but all of the available evidence before us? I've put it like this. It's the only hypothesis of my own that I've ever come up with. It's a version of, on this point anyway, it's a version of Joseph Schumpeter's hypothesis about creative destruction as the energy of capitalism. In order to believe in, not in a deistic God, in other words, a creator, a first cause, an imponderable starter, which of course only leads you to an infinite regression, because how could there be a starter who wasn't himself started or herself begun? Who created the God? Who made the creator? Who invented the inventor? Who designed the designer? Any fool can see the fallacy peering right over the shoulder of This hypothesis. But suppose it's not just a theistic question, but, a deistic question, but a theistic one. A God who answers prayers, a God who intervenes, a God who didn't just start this, but cares how it winds up, who cares what you do to your private parts, or to those of your children, and insists on their being mutilated, who knows what you should eat and what day of the week, who knows with which gender you may or may not recreate yourself, or be recreational with, and so forth. The deist has all their work still ahead of them to prove that there is such a being. Here's what you'd have to believe to be a theist. I've already shown the absurdity of deism, I hope. To be a theist, you'd have to believe this. How long do you think, ladies and gentlemen, I have 3 minutes, shan't, I hope, need them all. How long do you think the human species, as a distinct Homo sapiens, has been on the planet? Anyone want to shout a guess? Okay. Well, Richard Dawkins thinks 250,000 years, a quarter of a million. That's considered to be on the high end. Francis Collins, who's become a friend of mine, a very, very devout Christian, who, as you will know, sequenced the Human Genome Project and did the final report on the full-out discovery of that unravelment which showed us our kinship with other creatures and indeed with other non-creatures, other forms of vegetation and junk that's in our, undoubtedly proves us to be part of the creational soup. He thinks minimum 100,000. He's not quite sure if it's 250,000. All right, I only need 100,000. 100,000 years since we dared to became separate from the Cro-Magnons and the Neanderthals as our own species, Homo sapiens. Here's what you have to believe to be a theist. For 100,000 years, humanity is born. Perhaps 25% of it dies in childbirth or very shortly afterwards. Life expectancy, I don't know, 25 for a very long time. Infant mortality, extraordinary, after childbirth deaths, I mean. Killed by microorganisms we didn't know existed, by earthquakes that we thought were portents, by storms that we didn't know came from our climate system, by other events that arise from being born onto a cooling planet with deep cracks in its crust, faults in its crust. Then man-made things, turf wars, fights over women, fights over territory, over food, and so on. Very, very slow, gradual, exponential upward progress, we might like to think. Pretty slow, but at least we can claim, out of our own self-respect, man-made. And for the first 96,000 years of this experience, heaven watches with folded arms. Us go through this with indifference, without pity. And then around 4,000 years ago decides, gee, it's time to intervene. And the best way of doing that would probably be in Bronze Age Middle East, making appearances to stupefied, illiterate peasants, which could later be passed on. The news would get to China after about 1,000 years of that.
2 minutes.
That's what you have to believe. Aren't you glad you can't be made to believe that? Aren't you glad there's no theocracy anymore within range of you that can make you believe that? Do you know what it's like living in countries where you can be made to believe it? Do you know what the penalties are for not believing it? They're just exactly congruent with the stupidity of the belief itself. We would be better off, ladies and gentlemen, if we grew out of it. We would be better off if we'd grown out of it a long time ago. I've only had 15 minutes to show its falsity. The rest of the evening, I hope, can be devoted to its wickedness. But the falsity is part of the wickedness too, and thanks for hearing me out. Thank you.
I don't have a mic, so.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. After hearing that speech, I am so depressed. God almighty, if the Andromeda Galaxy doesn't finish me off and Christopher Hitchens doesn't, how many other threats will? Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, made a lot of money for him, even though atheism is a non-profit organization. I hope someone caught that. And I am a fan of Christopher Hitchens' work. This is our second debate. But my friends, I am profoundly disappointed with this work. It is his weakest book yet. In it, he is guilty of the same colossal closed-mindedness of which he accuses religion. The book is filled with logical inconsistencies, factual inaccuracies, and blatant untruths. In a nutshell, Christopher Hitchens is a secular fundamentalist fanatic. He falls prey to mankind's most base instinct, namely hatred. He hates religion. He even hates God, which is difficult since he doesn't exist. And most importantly, he hates hope. Like Richard Dawkins, who I have debated at Oxford University on several occasions, Hitchens is a scientific reductionist, reducing humans to naught but vapid animals, semi-literate primates, half-thinking apes. His book lacks joy, it lacks humor. It is a profoundly depressing tome about the decrepit nature of human existence. The book that I've launched tonight, The Broken American Male, available at fine bookstores everywhere, is the direct result of this shattered vision. Human beings are bereft of any real cosmic purpose. All they can do in life is revert to hunter-gatherers, gathering money during the day so they can hunt women at night. In so doing, they fulfill their genetic role of being naught but sperm donors. Jack Nicholson expressed it best in that great Bible of American literature, People magazine of December 21st, 2007. He said, when it comes to love, we men have more in common with a male dog than we do with a woman. Oh, this may be male chauvinism, but it's science, baby. Hence, my friends, Christopher Hitchens does not believe in any kind of heroes or human greatness. Of Martin Luther King, in his book, he writes, quote, he was a mammal like the rest of us, probably plagiarized his doctoral dissertation, had a notorious fondness for booze and for women, a good deal younger than his wife. Mahatma Gandhi is someone who would have caused millions of Indians to starve, and had we listened to him, we'd be worshiping cows. The Dalai Lama makes a claim that he's a hereditary king, and dissenting sects within his faith are persecuted. Of course, Mother Teresa bears the greatest brunt of his fury. He says of Mother Teresa, she was a friend of poverty, a fanatic, a fundamentalist, and a fraud. But tell us what you really think, Christopher. My friends, religion has a vastly different vision and a vastly different take. Yes, a man is a creature like any other, but he is born with the spiritual capacity to transcend instinct and to choose goodness, to rise above his animal nature and become godly. What to Hitchens is a failure that humans occasionally succumb to their nature is to us glory. When they choose inspiration over indulgence, they triumph over instinct. Hitchens is right. Human beings, in terms of DNA, are 98% exactly like primates. But in that 2%. In that 2% lies human consciousness, and therefore human conscience, human transcendence, and therefore human choice, human soulfulness, and therefore the indomitable human spirit. A watermelon is also 98% water, just like a jellyfish is, but they are hardly alike. I'm not eating any jellyfish anytime soon, and I cannot accept that we are nothing but thinking primates. To give you an idea of the degree of blindness that you're hearing tonight, I want to just choose a few examples of this loathing of religion that has made a great scholar become positively ignorant. He says that the Torah lacks compassion on page 99. Quote, the pitiless teachings of Moses, who never mentions human solidarity and compassion at all. Even school children know Leviticus 19:18 with the greatest statement of human solidarity in the history of the world. You must love your fellow man as yourself. He attacked circumcision a few moments ago. In his book, he calls it religious barbarism. Quote, it is a mutilation of a powerless infant with the aim of ruining its future sex life. As an authority on the subject, No, not because I have 8 children, but I wrote Kosher Sex. What a shame that Christopher Hitchens doesn't read the New York Times. He would have discovered, I'm sure you remember, it was a front-page story, December 14th, 2006, quote, circumcision appears to reduce a man's risk of contracting AIDS by 50%. In fact, the 2 largest AIDS charities on earth, quote, are considering paying for circumcisions in high-risk countries. So these great charities are going to inflict this barbarism in order to save people's lives. But this is the really fun part. Because he sees religion as primitive, he says that the most annoying and the most unfortunate of all Jewish holidays is Hanukkah. He calls it an absolutely tragic day in human history. Now this is funny. Parenthetically, he says, I love this, the Jews borrowed shamelessly from Christians in the pathetic hope of celebration that coincides with Christmas. Surely he knows that the Maccabees lived 300 years before the birth of Jesus, but we'll ignore that for a moment. What I love, what he says about Hanukkah is, it's a primitive holiday where Jews reject science and Hellenism for their primitive beliefs. Listen to this. The Jews felt the pull exerted by Athens. They chose the superstition mandated by the Torah. Let's see what enlightenment the Jews fought against during Hanukkah. The great Oxford historian, who was a friend of mine, Martin Goodman, says that Antiochus IV, the villain of Hanukkah, was, quote, called a barbarian and madman by his own people. If you look up in Wikipedia, just Google it. Antiochus IV put Jerusalem's inhabitants to death in the most cruel way. He insisted on slaughtering a pig in the temple, and when the Jews refused to eat it, quote, he cut off their hands and feet, burned them on the altar, scalped them, and this is the Greek Enlightenment that the Jews should not have resisted. Christopher, you supported the invasion of Iraq because you said that Saddam Hussein was a tyrant who didn't deserve to slaughter his people. But you decried the Jews for standing up against their own brutal oppressors. But my friends, it's really the values of those Greco-Romans that the Jews rejected. These great enlightened values that Christopher Hitchens decries us religious Neanderthals for rejecting. Those great values like the people of Sparta, the Greeks, who used to inspect newborn infants, and if they were found to be weakly, they would cast them from Mount Tegaros. The Romans, of course, would inspect grown adults, and if they were mentally infirm, they would be thrown from the Tarpeian Rock. Don't think I'm being unfair in citing ancient Hellenistic values against religious ones. No less an authority than Francis Crick, the Nobel Prize-winning scientist who mapped the DNA molecule, suggested that birth in our time come 2 days after parturition, so that a baby could be examined for defects, and if found to be sufficiently deleterious, could be removed with impunity since it has not yet been born. He also suggested that we declare death at the age of 80 when people are no longer useful. Professor Bentley Glass said good and evil should have a scientific evolutionary connotation. They should be divorced from their traditional connotation, and they should connote what is good and bad for the species, so a child with Tay-Sachs would be eliminated. In fact, Hitchens himself, something that sounds quite frightening, page 221 of his book. A very large number of pregnancies are aborted, he's speaking about miscarriages, because of malformation. Sad though this is, it is probably less miserable an outcome than the vast number of deformed or idiot children who would otherwise have been born, or whose brief lives would have been a torment to themselves and others. I therefore challenge my august colleague to explain why then should we not euthanize Down syndrome children? They are a burden to their parents. They can contribute nothing to the society. They are the idiot children of whom even our own Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said, famously, 3 generations of idiots are enough, when so many states here in America used to sterilize the mentally handicapped. What was wrong with that? In fact, let me give you 2 quotations, and I would like you to tell me who you think they are from. Number 1, in nature there is no pity for the lesser creatures when they are destroyed so that the fittest may survive. Going against nature brings ruin to man. It is only Jewish impudence to demand that we overcome nature. Listen to this very similar quote. The more civilized so-called Caucasian races, the white people, have beaten the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence. The white people decimated the dark people. Looking at the world at no very distant date, What an endless number of the lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races. First quotation was from a politician. His name was Adolf Hitler. The second quotation was from a scientist. His name was Charles Darwin. Evolutionary theory, as I intend to demonstrate in the second part of this debate, is based on the survival of the fittest. It is not good for the species or for the human race to sustain people who are weaker. Charity is a religious concept, pure and simple. That's why you heard such a depressing presentation. There is no hope. Life has no amber. There is nothing that glows. In fact, Sir Arthur Keith, the greatest British evolutionist of the World War II period, said, quote, "To see evolutionary measures being applied vigorously, one must turn to Germany of 1942. We see Hitler devoutly convinced that evolution produces the only real basis for a national policy. The means he adopted was organized slaughter to secure the German race. They needed more space, they needed more food. You kill the weaker ones to protect the stronger ones. The German Führer, as I have consistently maintained," wrote Sir Arthur Keith, "is an evolutionist and seeks to make the practice of Germany conform to evolution." And here you have why Christopher Hitchens attacks the Ten Commandments. You know, this is amazing, because he says about the Ten Commandments, listen to this: "However little one thinks of the Jewish tradition, it is surely insulting to the people of Moses to imagine they had come this far under the impression that murder, adultery, theft, and perjury were permissible." But he misses the entire point. God didn't bring the Jews to the foot of Mount Sinai to tell them not to kill. God brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai so they would understand that do not murder is God's law. Not now, not ever. There is no excuse. This is why genocide is perpetrated by nations who have man-made laws. There were laws against murder in Ottoman Turkey. There were laws against murder in Nazi Germany. There were laws against murder in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge. But they were human laws and subject to human tampering. That's why the Ten Commandments have preserved the morality of a nation who, even when they were turned into soap and lampshades during the Holocaust, never blew up a German school bus, because we live by that edict, do not murder. My friends, open your eyes and see what I see. As Rabbi Akiva famously said, just as the garment testifies to the weaver, the door to the carpenter, the house to the builder, so the entire world testifies to God, the Creator. In this book, which I published as a result of my debates with Richard Dawkins at Oxford, this is 13 years old. I have about another minute. And surely science has found far greater wonders since then. If the Earth were closer or further from the sun, by just a little bit, the heat or cold it generated would make life impossible. If the Earth were not tilted on its axis 23 degrees, huge mountains of ice would pile up from the water vapor of the oceans. The Earth revolves at a speed of 1,000 miles per hour. If it were to revolve at just 100 miles per hour, night and day would increase 10 times in duration. Plants would be scorched in the day, seedlings would be frozen at night. If the moon were a bit closer to the Earth, the tide would flood all lands, including the high mountains. If the oceans were deeper, carbon dioxide and oxygen would be absorbed and no plants could exist. If the atmosphere were thinner, millions of meteors which are burned up in the air would fall to the Earth and cause limitless devastation. While most substances contract when they freeze, water miraculously expands by 1/11 of its volume. This makes ice float on the top and it allows the fish to survive. Till today, the cause of this expansion perplexes scientists. 2 weeks ago, the New York Times Magazine wrote, January 13, 2008, "The moral sense is an innate part of being human. We are born with innate morality. It is not acquired." A list of human universals, collected by anthropologist Donald Brown, includes moral concepts, including a distinction between right and wrong, empathy, fairness, admiration, generosity, shame. These are all character traits which are antithetical to evolution, which are about ensuring that your genes survive. Finally, my friends, listen to this. The little embryo, that little baby that will have to grow up in a world of hope, hearing so much about how we're the only forlorn rock without any life surrounding us. It's born with 10,000 taste buds in its mouth. Some 12 trillion nerve endings will form in the baby's nose to help it detect fragrances of odors in the air. More than 100,000 nerve cells will be devoted to reacting to Beethoven's symphony. The piano has 240 strings, but a baby's ear will have 240,000 hearing units. Those 10,000 spokes, by the way, the million nerve endings of the optical nerves of the eye which connects with the brain and somehow grows from two different directions and meets 1 million nerve endings, is so vast that if were it mapped, the entire world's telephone cable system would be only a small fraction of it, a small fraction. It has no designer at all, according to Christopher Hitchens. Since I have to end, let me just tell you, of course, science says that this phenomenal complexity came about through genetic mutation and natural selection. When I come back, we'll explore whether that is the case, or whether such vast complexity could never have come about spontaneously, and whether those who believe it did are guilty of cognitive dissonance, afraid of a truth so great that they're forced to deny it.
Well, as some of you already know, never buy crackling from a moil. The rabbi is in the uplift business. C'est son métier, as was once said. And he thinks it's a point against me that some of the conclusions I draw are not such as to make one happy. I'm unused to arguing in this style. I will simply point out that that's what I'm expected to do in a debate that's organized along these lines against someone who thinks that evolution by means of natural selection, which is a hypothesis, a theory, which, if tested, always works, which allows us to sequence the DNA of the influenza virus so that the next time it comes, unlike 1919, it won't kill us all, because we know of its kinship with ourselves, because we know we ourselves evolved from sightless bacteria, because we have the computer models by which the eye was evolved in 40 different ways, at least, among different species. So there's nothing left to argue with except with people like Rabbi Boteach and Governor Huckabee of Arkansas, who, head as he is of what I would describe as a non-philo-Semitic Christian organization, believes that Adam and Eve were real and indeed quite recent people. In my experience, there's nothing to be done with points like this except to underline them. Governor Huckabee, in fact, doesn't even know what he doesn't believe when putting up his chubby hand to say he was among those in the room who didn't believe in the theory of evolution. He said, "No, I don't believe that I'm descended from a monkey." Well, as you know, the theory of evolution does not demand that you believe anything remotely like that. It points to a common ancestry between other primates and ourselves. If we were descended from monkeys, we'd probably look quite a lot like Governor Huckabee. Now, I just have spent a second on the taunt about being a fundamentalist. To be a fundamentalist is to insist that something can be advanced on faith alone and without evidence. I will submit myself to your fair-mindedness, ladies and gentlemen, and ask if anything I said to you, or am saying now, requires that of you, that you take an act of faith or leap of faith as if it were an ethical thing to do, or that you take one at all for anything I say. Of course I don't. There's nothing in common between me and any other faith-based person of any kind. It's one of the last-ditch arguments that our foes, the foes of science and science education and the theory of evolution by natural selection as the explanation for our presence here, have had to come up with in their desperation. Hatred, yes, I plead guilty to that. One of the many things I don't like about Christianity is that it tells me to love my enemies. I don't do that, and I don't want you doing it for me either. Go love your own enemies. Don't be loving mine. I'll get on with the business of destroying, isolating, and combating the enemies of civilization. I don't need any... and I don't need any sickly advice from Nazareth, from the man who, after all the Old Testament horrors that we know about, none of them included the punishment of hell. There's no hell in the Old Testament. So the credit of the Jewish people, actually, when God and Moses have done with enjoining genocide on you, which, by the way, they do, according to those books. I don't know which books the rabbi's been reading, but he might want to tell you what happened to the Amalekites. Where are the Midianites? Happened to all these people. We know what we were told to do to them. So glad to think that those books are fictional, because if they were true, we would all be bespattered with the blood of others to please a hideous authority. But no punishment once he's done with you, once the earth is closed over you, that's it. There's no torture of the dead. Not till gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Do you get that? My same point about the overrated figures of Dr. King and Mahatma Gandhi. It's a very bad thing, it seems to me, that especially in white liberal society, the plaster saint of Martin Luther King has become iconographic. It's led to two bad consequences that I can think of. One, the great black secularists and socialists and trade union leaders, some of whom spoke at this very podium, Bayard Rustin, A. Philip Randolph and the others, the people who actually organized the March on Washington, with their white friends, secular friends like Victor Reuther of the United Automobile Workers, the people who actually put this great movement of liberation onto the streets, are airbrushed from history. White people are given deliberately the impression, well, black folks sure like their preachers and their pulpit men. And as a result, anyone who can claim to be a preacher, a fraud, a demagogue, a crook, like Al Sharpton or Jesse Jackson, is automatically awarded the right to represent black America. This is not progress. Very well? I hope you understand me. It's not Dr. King's fault. That is not Dr. King's fault, but as I say in my book, but it is the fault of those who make a cult out of him and who dare to say that without religious permission, we wouldn't know how to demand equal rights for our African-American brothers and sisters. Well, excuse me, we don't need religious permission for that, and the case for it had been made by the secular left long before Dr. King started preaching, and that's precisely why he was always attacked in his lifetime for having communist and socialist and Marxist friends, which he did, who had done most of the spade work. So let's again be very clear what we're talking about. I'm sorry, I do not believe the Dalai Lama's claim either to be hereditary king or hereditary God, and I think anyone who does believe it is a fool. And there hasn't been even the pretense of an election in the Tibetan exile community that he's now been leading for more than almost half a century in Dharamsala in India. It is still run as an absolute despotism. People who like that sort of thing, like that sort of thing. More to the purpose, and you'll let me know, Mr. Chairman, when I'm coming to the... I have rather a crazy salad of slanders to respond to, and I don't want to miss any of them out. If you want to saw off the end of your penis, you're welcome. You're not to do it to a child who hasn't asked for it. Same with the genitals of a little girl. If she thinks later on she'd be better off without them, let her take, or have taken to her, a sharp instrument. If it proves that it's good for AIDS, which it might well be, I've heard it's been said that it's good for cervical cancer, let it be decided by the grown-up. It is not right, it is not moral, it is in fact wicked to submit children to mutilation of their genitalia or to anyone without their consent. Do you understand that that this elementary point only needs to be made because of wickedness enjoined by religion? The rabbi here is a fairly humane guy. He wouldn't, if he didn't think God was involved, ever consider mutilating the genitals of a child. But because it's a covenant with God, anything can be done. Now, don't you see? You laugh, but you should be crying. I said crying. Okay, suit yourself. Now, I'm not here to defend Zeus or Juno or Aphrodite. I listed them in the list of barbaric and forgotten gods. The Jews who celebrate Hanukkah, which, by the way, I think you will have to agree, only became promoted in the United States. Among Jews, it's a relatively minor holiday because of its nearness to Christmas Day. The Jews who particularly care about that holiday are not arguing against the worship of Zeus. They're arguing against, as the rabbi perfectly well knows, the idea of the Epikuros, what in Orthodox Judaism is known as the heretic, the unbeliever. The Epikuros, the follower of Epicurus. Epicurus and Lucretius were the secular Hellenists, the ones who discovered that the world was made of atoms, and that the gods, if they exist, do not concern themselves with human affairs, because, among other things, they avoid unnecessary pain. Now, there's a discovery that's worth having, and the Jews want you to turn away, the Orthodox Jews want you to turn away from the unbelievable scholarship and originality and humanism of Epicurus and Lucretius to look at a candle. Hey, look, goggle at this. It burned an extra day or two, or is it 8? This is what retards human intelligence and human civilization. Now, of course you may, I'll close on this because I don't want to trespass on your time or the rabbis. Of course you can be an atheist And you can be a eugenicist, you can be a fascist, you can be a Stalinist, you can be a nihilist, you can be a sadist. Atheism, unbelief, the repudiation of the supernatural, is not a necessary, it's not a sufficient condition, not a sufficient condition for wisdom or for enlightenment, but it is, and I say it joylessly, humorlessly, gloomily, pessimistically, it is a necessary one. Thanks.
My objection to the current religious secular debate is that for so many centuries, Christopher Hitchens is right, religion had a very closed mind. Who has the closed mind now? Who uses character assassination to portray anyone who has certain beliefs that they try to root in logic as closed-minded, unscholarly? The gist of my argument is that Christopher Hitchens, who is one of America's most talented writers, has become so fanatical in his hatred of religion that he just invents things to decry it. For example, he can make fun of the fact that I don't believe in evolution, although I never even said that. I believe in evolutionary development, as the Torah itself says. 6 days of creation, the mineral was followed by the vegetable, then the animal, then the intellectual. The question is whether this is guided. The question is whether mathematical possibilities allows for this. But before I even get to that, here's an example of just pure invention in order to make religion, Jews, the state of Israel look bad. Listen to this. He's writing about the greatest scientists of the 20th century, saying, don't be impressed that Einstein believed in God, because he didn't believe in the God that we believe in. He was a deist, and, quote, offered the first presidency of the state of Israel. Einstein declined because of his many qualms about the way Zionism was tending. That is pure, utter fabrication. First of all, Einstein was offered the second presidency. The first president was Chaim Weizmann. He was offered it in 1952. He died 3 years later. The Princeton Review says he turned it down, quote, because he had neither the desire nor the energy to run a country. He was a scientist. The New York Sun, in an essay about the subject, he politely and sensibly declined on the grounds that it would interfere with his scientific work. He loved Israel. He was one of the great Zionists of the 20th century. Anything to portray religion in a negative light. As far as the great complexity, well, you continually invent in your book. I'll get to that in a moment. You'll have to just be patient as I dissect it. My friends, most people today accept evolutionary principles without being knowledgeable of them. I actually studied them and debated some of the world's greatest evolutionary biologists, from Richard Dawkins, 4 debates, John Maynard Smith, professor of evolutionary biology, University of Sussex, he was the world's greatest living evolutionist at the time. For evolution to work, you need 2 things. You need genetic mutation and you need natural selection. Now, genetic mutation means that when DNA replicates, it introduces, through a mistake in copying itself, a new feature that is not existent in the parental type. So for that to happen, you need mutation to do 2 things. Number 1, they have to be very common, because you have great complexity in the world. Number 2, they have to be beneficial. Let's see what the world's greatest scientists say about mutation. Because remember, Darwin knew nothing about mutation. Darwin believed in adaptation. And he based it on the Lamarckian theory of acquired characteristics that preceded him. Here is what H.J. Muller, the world's foremost expert on mutation, Nobel Prize winner, says, quote, mutations are of random nature. Accordingly, the vast majority, certainly well over 99%, are harmful. Nobel Prize winner Ernst Mayr. These are all evolutionists. Most of them are atheists. It is a considerable strain on one's credulity to assume that finely balanced systems, such as certain sense organs, could be improved by random mutations. Will the eye get better if it makes a mistake in its replication? In fact, the author of The Mystery of Heredity concludes, listen to this, the vast majority of mutants in any organism are so detrimental as to believe that it is impossible for them to lead to complexity. These are people who all believe in evolution. Now, Julian Huxley, from the most important of all evolutionary families, wrote the following. We should clearly have to breed, to get a horse, he says, 1,000,000 strains, 1,000 squared, to get 2 favorable mutations. Up to 1,000 to the millionth power to produce a horse. Now listen to this. 1,000 to the millionth power to produce a horse, which isn't even as complex as the human brain, becomes 1 with 3 million zeros written after it. That would take 3 volumes of 500 pages just to print. No one would bet on anything so improbable happening, and yet, ta-da, it has happened. That's how he ends the quote. Now, how could evolutionists say on the one hand, mutation is destructive? I mean, if you're born with a third arm, you're not really doing that well, I assure you. Even though it seems that you've gone forward, you've gone backward. So how could this theory, and again, I'm not denying evolution. I'm saying evolution needs a guiding parent because the numbers are impossible. How could we believe that things, just a horse, 1 to the 3 millionth power, 1,500 pages to write the number, would this ever happen? So here's how a Harvard professor answers it. The important point is that since the origin of life belongs in the category of at least once phenomena, time is on its side. However impossible we regard this event, given enough time, it will almost certainly happen at least once. Time is in fact the hero of the plot. I love this part, listen carefully. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, the probable virtually certain. One has to only wait because time itself performs miracles. Do you get it? I believe in a 3-word entity called God. Christopher Hitchens believes in a 4-word entity called time. The essence of evolutionary theory, which is undeniable, is that if you give enough time, this is all going to happen. My friends, when I was young, and I'm not a scientist, I remember, and you remember, they told us the world was 4 billion years old. Then they said it was 8 billion. Now we're up to 16. Soon it'll be 20, 30. Soon they'll give it 1 trillion years. Now why? Because the more we discover the complexity of life and the impossibility of any of this stuff evolving, the more time we need. Let me tell you something. You can give this forever. Something something that mathematically has 300 million zeros after it is never going to happen. I don't care if you have forever. That's why, as Christopher Hitchens said, it didn't happen on all the other planets. If he's right and I'm wrong, why did life happen only here? We have 16 billion years. There's natural selection there. There's genetic mutation there. Why didn't it happen there? One place? Oh, he'll tell you that we haven't yet found it. Well, we have all of these. He's seen the galaxy Andromeda. It's not there. Let me tell you. I'm not the only person who doesn't believe in evolution without guidance. And let me be clear about that. The greatest scientist. He passed away a few years ago, but I met him at Oxford. From Harvard, Stephen Jay Gould. He didn't believe in evolution. He believed in punctuated equilibrium. I saw him debate Richard Dawkins. He destroyed evolution, and he's an atheist. He said that the fossil record does not reflect evolution. Sir Fred Hoyle said that because there are trillions of mutations that would have to take place, and none of those organisms would have survived, because the possibility of a genetic mutation is 99.9 negative, detrimental, and lethal to the organism. So Hoyle said you would have to find trillions of destroyed organisms that don't exist. In fact, it was Darwin himself who said that the greatest objection to his theory, because let's remember, The Origin of Species, published in 1863, was not a tome about the origin of life. It was a theory to explain the fossil record, but the problem was that there were missing transitional links. So what he said was, I'd like to give you the exact quote, Darwin said that the imperfection of the fossil record comes entirely to the fact that we have not yet dug sufficiently. In 1863, that would make sense. But my friends, we've now dug up the whole world. We're looking for oil. We're looking for diamonds. We've dug up everywhere. We've barely found them. So Stephen Jay Gould, as Christopher Hitchens well knows, doesn't believe in evolution, or didn't. He argued for punctuated equilibrium, great leaps, which explains the dearth of fossils. To still be an evolutionist today, you have to have faith. There is no evidence. The transitional links barely exist. That's why when Dawkins, who, again, friend of mine, I debated him, when he debated Stephen Jay Gould, he had nothing to say. What evidence? Where are these trillions and trillions and trillions of transitional links? Remember, you need billions of mutations to go from a single cell amoeba to the eye. And yet, amazingly, which would give us an untold number of failed transitional steps, and they don't exist. You know what's interesting to me as well? Christopher Hitchens, just give me 30 seconds here. Christopher Hitchens says that the eye is not impressive. Everything about him is the eye is nothing, and there's no complexity, and what are you talking about? The organism is so ill-formed. He says that the eye is, quote, the ineptitude of design, page 82. He even says, the anatomy of the eye, in fact, shows anything but intelligence. It is built upside down and backwards. Well, Charles Darwin didn't think so. I'm glad you don't like your eyes, but Darwin said, quote, "I became sick when I thought of how the complexity of the eye could have evolved." He then said, Charles Darwin, "To suppose that the eye could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest possible degree." Then Christopher Hitchens says he says, "Why have we agreed so easily to call this exploded old non-theory, the theory of intelligent design, by its cunningly chosen new disguise of intelligent design? There is nothing intelligent about it." Let me therefore conclude with the words of Isaac Asimov, the greatest science fiction writer of the 20th century. "In man, there is a 3-pound brain, which, as far as we know, is the most complex and orderly arrangement of matter in the universe." I mean, God Almighty. All you need to do to prove the existence of God and how intelligent the design of our universe is to see how smart Christopher Hitchens is.
We'll sit for the third. We'll sit for the third.
You want to sit?
Yeah, sit.
Well, if I can't be erect, I'd at least rather be upstanding. I have to sit for this. He says I got to sit. Okay.
We agreed.
All right. There was a terrible moment, I think it was when Lawrence Krauss was talking about the Andromeda Galaxy and it's heading towards us, when someone got up and said to him, "Doctor, did you say it was going to collide with our galaxy in 5 billion years or 5 million? And Lawrence said 5 billion. The guy said, "That's a huge relief." I thought you said 5 million there for a second. Now, on the fabrication point, I can't sit still or stand still if I was standing and be accused of that. The argument about Einstein and the State of Israel has nothing to do with religion at all. There may have been a religious element in his opposition to a Jewish state. He was for a state for Jews, but not for a Jewish state, a distinction that a lot of people have forgotten. The same distinction that was made by I.F. Stone, Judah Magnus, and others, often in debates under this roof, as a matter of fact. I don't know how much influence that had on his decision to reject the offer from Ben-Gurion, who at one point said to his cabinet, "What are we going to do if he says yes?" But I would be very surprised if there was nothing to do with it. At any rate, it has no bearing whatever on the fact that Einstein believed only in Spinoza's God. In other words, not, as Rabbi Shmuley would have you believe, in God as an intervening or supervising or caring force, but as the one Spinoza identified, the pantheistic one. These distinctions are, I think, important and worth stressing. On the claim that Stephen Jay Gould did not believe in evolution, I really do not know where to begin. I think the best thing to do would be to read any chapter of any of his books. And in fact, I think I might indeed recommend the one where he has a very famous, very celebrated disagreement with Richard Dawkins on the question not of whether evolution occurred, because nobody denies that. That it occurred, we know. It's in the record of molecular biology and it's in the fossil record. There's a lot of argument about how, and there is a certain amount of argument about the punctuations, and a lot of those gaps are only just now being filled in. Only just now we're discovering intermediate species, the partly vertebrate yet amphibian, and for example, a very, very important one recently in northern Canada. It's in Gould's book on the Burgess Shale that the most sobering point is made, a point that even I as a materialist find rather shaking. I don't, by the way, deny things because they don't cheer me up. It's not my attitude to evidence, but I would like to think too that I was a little bit more than the primate that I so self-evidently am. But in Stephen Jay Gould's account of the Burgess Shale, which I think is his best book, is the most beautiful, the most finished, and the most polished of his books, he says there's a Cambrian vertebrate, a little creature called Paculia gracilens, that has the beginnings of a backbone. It could have got washed out in one of the great subsequent dyings out. It could have done. If it had, human beings would never have appeared. This is the first we can find of a vertebrate. It could very easily have gone, but it didn't. And as a result, we're here having this conversation. You can say that's miraculous if you like. You can say that only God would have thought of such a thing. But, and that's the way you'd think if that's the way you thought. Because there will always be people who will say, oh, well, we used not to think about these fossils. We thought that was all nonsense. It was argued until fairly recently by the godly, God put the bones in the rocks to test our faith. At least we don't deny they're there, they're just there as a test. Now you have animatronic dinosaurs playing with animatronic children in the Creation Museum that just opened in Ohio. And there are those who say we didn't used to think about that the Big Bang could possibly be true. In fact, the Big Bang itself is a term like Tory, like suffragette, like impressionist, and other terms, originally evolved as a term of abuse, as a term of mockery. It's then adopted by its exponents. Big Bang was what Fred Hoyle used to say to try and dismiss the idea. He said, oh, some people think it all began with the Big Bang. Now we know there was a time when everything was inside something about the size of a baseball that's now 4,000 billion galaxies. And what my daughter wants to know is what was outside the baseball. And I don't know. But we know that much. People say, oh, well, nothing so amazing could have happened without God. So there's a name for this kind of argument, a very old and important name. It also comes largely from work at Oxford University, though it's actually attributable largely to Sir Karl Popper. It's called unfalsifiability. It's an argument you can't beat, because it isn't an argument. If you say, well, now I see how complex everything is, it would have to be God who was responsible. There's no way I can disprove that. There's no way I can falsify it. And unfalsifiability, counterintuitively, is quite rightly considered to be a test, not of the strength of an argument, but of its extreme weakness. In fact, of its non-existence as an argument. Now, I left unanswered a point about social Darwinism, and if I can have that, okay. It was, in fact, at the Scopes trial, the contention of William Jennings Bryan, not just that evolution had not occurred, but that it shouldn't have occurred, because it would mean that only the fittest would survive. Now, we don't want that to be true, and we can actually take steps to make sure, as humans, that it isn't absolutely the only rule of existence. But when the rabbi quite misrepresented what I say about abortion, I was talking about how nature aborts so many unborn children, not how humans do or should or might have to, but how nature takes care of it. And I said, because when we were on the savannah and sharing the territory and diminishing in size as a tribe ourselves, and having to bear live young in an environment full of predators, probably if we bore 8 or 9 children, some of them sickly with lolling heads and diarrhea, we wouldn't be able to pick them up and carry them and run away fast enough. It's a fact. Because it's a fact, and because it's unpleasant, and because, as Darwin says, it betrays, has with it, as everything about us does, the lowly stamp of our original origin, doesn't mean it isn't so. So the beginning of wisdom, I would say, is the recognition of what science has been able to teach us. And neither to deny that, as the rabbi does in one tone of voice, or to claim that it shows how clever God is with another tone. Make up your mind, you can't have it both ways, and actually you're wrong twice. Thanks.
I don't care how much you dislike religion, and I don't care how false you believe the faith in God is. You can't invent facts to sustain your argument. You can't be unscientific when you complain that religion is unscientific. That's the whole problem with this book. It's the problem with everything you've heard tonight. It's the problem with the utter distortions that we continue to hear. You said that your attack about Einstein, which you didn't respond to, because you clearly invented out of whole cloth this idea that he didn't want to be president because of Zionism. You said it's not about religion. What about this? Speaking about Dr. Baruch Goldstein, Christopher Hitchens writes, while serving as a physician in the Israeli army, he had announced that he would not treat non-Jewish patients, such as Israeli Arabs, on the Sabbath. As it happens, he was obeying rabbinic law and declining to do this, as many Israeli religious courts have confirmed. I challenge Mr. Hitchens to name a single Jewish court in the entire world that would ever rule that a non-Jew should not be treated on the Sabbath. In fact, if he names it, I will buy 100 copies of his book and I will give it to, talking about a mainstream, just a regular Jewish court. I will give 100 copies of his book to my religious friends. But if he fails, I challenge him to buy 100 copies of my book, or let's make that 1,000. Not only does the Talmud obligate us to treat non-Jews on the Sabbath. In fact, Noach Feldman, my dear friend, the Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, who debated me on this subject, he famously wrote about the debate in the Talmud, how there was a steering within the Talmud that maybe you shouldn't. And this was because the non-Jews they were talking about were Roman centurions. That's when the Talmud was written. These were horrible troops that persecuted Jews. But even then they said that you have to. It's a law in Judaism. The court would be stripped of its authority in a moment and be declared racist. In fact, Christopher Hitchens, who portrays Jews throughout this book as being closed-minded, racist, he attacks Israel nonstop based on non-existent evidence. He doesn't even know Judaism, which he should study a bit before he writes about it. I mean, I didn't just get up and talk about evolution. I tried to study the text. I'm not a great scientist, but I've debated leading scientists, and I prepared for those debates. You should prepare if you're going to write about this. Of us 4:3, do not despise any man. The rabbis declared, quote, even a Gentile who studies God's law is equal to the high priest 2,000 years ago. A non-Jew equal to the high priest. Tosefta, Sanhedrin 13, the righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come. Non-Jews go to heaven. Tana Tevei Eliyahu Rabbah 9, I call upon heaven and earth as witnesses. Any individual, whether Gentile or Jew, man or woman, servant or maid, can bring the divine presence upon himself in accordance with his deeds. That is a slander against Jews to say that any Jewish court would say that non-Jews should not be treated, and the state of Israel treats every single Arab and Palestinian, even when terrorists are the ones who are brought to the hospitals. The possibility of the human eye evolving has been equated to monkeys randomly hitting the keys on a typewriter, typing Shakespeare's Hamlet. You've heard this not once but 4 quadrillion times. Now, again, he said that Stephen Jay Gould believed in evolution. He believes in punctuated equilibrium. Evolution means to slowly evolve with great time. He believed in these vast quantum leaps. Read the books. See who's telling the truth. He did not believe in slow evolution. Dawkins is one of the last people who still believes it. Fred Hoyle, one of the smartest British scientists, mathematicians of the 20th century, famously wrote, life cannot have a random beginning. Troops of monkeys thundering away at random typewriters could not produce the works of Shakespeare. But listen why. For the practical reason that the whole observable universe is not large enough to contain the waste paper baskets required for the deposition of the wrong attempts. You just heard Christopher Hitchens say we're beginning to find the transitional links. God Almighty, we're only beginning? Do you realize how many trillions of these links have to exist? Where are they? We have found oil, we have found gold, we have found diamonds. They should be here on the desk. They should be here in my notes. Finally, this whole thing about values, my friends, you remember sadly that I spoke about Francis Crick before, his partner James Watson, who mapped the double helix DNA molecule. You remember that tragically, sadly, on October 14th, 2007, he told the London Times that he's inherently gloomy about the prospect for Africa because all our policies are based on the idea that blacks and whites are of equal intelligence, but the evidence says that's not the case. He was just echoing what Thomas Huxley, the famous Darwinian bulldog, the greatest progenitor of evolution in history, said, quote, no rational man, cognizant of the facts, believes that the average Negro is the equal, still less the superior, of the white man. To his dying day, Charles Darwin himself believed that blacks were the missing link between whites and apes. Now, that doesn't mean that every evolutionist is a racist, God forbid. Christopher Hitchens is at the forefront of defending human life around the world, and he's a phenomenal hero. But it does mean that when he goes out to save human life, it's not because of evolutionary ethics. It's because of religion that declared the infinite sanctity of life. My point before, quoting him about miscarriages, was not that he would ever argue for euthanizing infants. It's rather the fact that he doesn't argue for that in acknowledging that these Down syndrome babies are nothing but a burden and can contribute. And they're a burden to everyone around them. They will suck out their parents' resources.
Rabbi Boteach, I have to stop you, okay?
It's because he observes the 10 Commandments that says do not murder. It's our values he's embraced.
We have, ladies and gentlemen, we have a number of questions. We have a number of questions from the floor, and we have a number of questions that arrived to us from around the country. And one of them, from Cincinnati, Ohio, was precisely the question that, were I permitted to engage the debaters, would have wanted to ask myself. So I ask our two presenters, I ask Christopher Hitchens first, and then Rabbi Boteach second, in 2 or 3 minutes. Sorry, that's about all you have. question is it possible to talk about does God exist without asking, when you use the word God, what do you mean?
Very good. But it won't have escaped your attention, Rabbi, or the audience, I think, that I was asked to answer a direct challenge by the Rabbi a moment ago. And I won't have it said that I didn't. On the matter of whether an Israeli court ever ruled that Dr. Baruch Goldstein was right and you could refuse to help a non-Jew on the Shabbat, I refer you to my great mentor in Spinoza studies, Dr. Israel Shahak, S-H-A-H-A-K. His book, The Jewish Religion and His Attitude to Non-Jews. He's the very brave professor of chemistry at the Hebrew University who brought that case and lost it in the High Court in Jerusalem, and a very celebrated write-up of the topic in Haaretz. I would, of course, never make such a suggestion. Excuse me. And the rabbinical courts also. He lost the whole case. Very important. Look it up. The book is easily found. It's published by Pluto Press. Also, if you look up the history as told by him and his colleague Dr. Norton Mezovinsky of Dr. Baruch Goldstein, you will discover things that will make you glad that, as I said in a talk which you can also look up at the Spertus Institute, Jewish University in Chicago recently, very glad that it seems that Jews have a gene for atheism. The great Jewish contribution has always been to humanism and to human solidarity, and it is that, and not the wailings and bleatings to an empty sky.
Gentlemen, can we talk
that distinguish
about...
it. Now, yes.
Can we talk about God,
to the topic.
please?
Well,
to
the question of I'm sorry, I could hardly let such a challenge go in all decency. Now, I can do the rest very quickly. It's called the ontological argument. It says that if you can name the idea of a God, surely there must be something existent or real, at any rate, that you are talking about. It's not the teapot that Bertrand Russell postulates orbiting the sun. To talk about it is to postulate it. Well, this, of course, is a piece of circular reasoning, but I hope I helped to clarify it in my opening statement by saying there's every difference between being a deist and a theist. Science and reason cannot disprove the existence of a first cause or a creator. They cannot do that. We can only say that everything works without that assumption, and there is no evidence on the other side of the case. This seems to us to license unbelief. To the theistic argument of a God who actually is interested in answering prayers, cares who you marry, who you go to bed with, what you eat, which side wins in a war, and so forth, we say this is human propaganda, self-evidently man-made, and the so-called miraculous evidence for it has been repeatedly and conclusively falsified and disproved.
You know, I must be one of those half-thinking primates or half-intelligent primates that Christopher Hitchens speaks of, because it strains credulity. Did the rest of you just hear a great writer say that the Israeli Supreme Court is respected throughout the world for its fairness, judiciousness, ruled that you cannot save a non-Jewish life on the Sabbath? It's not even a religious court. It's always attacked for being the most secular court. The religious people don't like that court.
The rabbinical court.
You said the High Court.
I said High Rabbinical Court.
No, you said High Court. Maybe it's the Rabbinical Court. Okay, well, then let me just say, if you're wrong, if you're now going back and saying, okay, fair enough, how could you write that? Wait, let me finish.
No, you be very careful, sir.
You have the book in front of you, even though I bought it. It's my book.
You be very careful, sir.
Where's the footnote? When you write something in a book that a Jewish court will not treat a non-Jewish life, don't you think you ought to cite a footnote?
I've given...
Gentlemen, please.
Wait a minute. A second ago you mentioned the term character assassination. Be careful your character doesn't commit suicide in front of everyone in this room.
That's pretty harsh.
I gave careful chapter, name, author, and book citations, knowing that I'm televised, willing to stand up for what I said. Don't you try and misquote me in front of everybody.
I want to repeat.
Even dumber than you do now.
Okay, I want to repeat.
Rabbi,
I want to repeat. Okay,
Rabbi Boteach, can we talk about God, please?
Okay, well, I just want to repeat that we heard tonight that a high rabbinical court said you cannot save a non-Jewish life on the Sabbath. That is absolutely false, and we will look it up. We'll have to look it up after the
And there
debate.
are 100 books writing on it.
And that's
We'll
why
come
he
back
can't
to
cite
it.
the court. He
100
cites a
books.
book, but I want to hear the court.
100 books
Well,
writing on it, big
absolutely
boys.
not true. But be
We'll
that
come
as it
back
may.
to this. Rabbi Boteach,
I'll be there.
is it possible to talk about does God exist without asking, when you use the word God, what do you mean?
When I use the word God, I use it to connote the supreme moral authority. He who said that murder is wrong and that life is of infinite value, which is why life to us is so precious, which is why in this great country in the United States, we do take care of our elderly. It's the reason why we don't accept the Kevorkians of this world, who want to put people to death once they believe that their life is riddled with too much pain. I have sat with teenagers who wanted to kill themselves, thinking that their life was riddled with so much pain. My job at that moment was to be reminded that life is of infinite value. When I speak of God, obviously, when an evolutionist speaks of God, he thinks of a myth. But as I stated earlier, my contention is that evolution, which I accept with a designer watching its slow ascendancy, evolution believes that time is God. That if you give anything enough time, you will have miracles. That's just a euphemism. Time becomes a euphemism for God. The average secular evolutionist, like Christopher Hitchens, believes that given enough time, anything can happen. Which, by the way, utterly undermines everything he said earlier about the hopelessness of our situation and galaxies that are going to destroy us, because God willing, time will save us. And no doubt, it will come to our salvation. I should say that the reason why people like Hitler so hated religion, because he always identified religion as his greatest enemy, like from Martin Bormann's Table Talk, the heaviest blow that ever struck humanity was Christianity. We have no sort of use for a fairy tale invented by Jews, is because Hitler did not seek to destroy the Jews. He sought to impose a new value system on the world, a racial value system, which is the natural outgrowth of a belief in evolutionary phylums and strata and different races. The Bible establishes that we are all one race. We are all equally created in the image of God. It does not in any way mean that an evolutionist is a racist, God forbid. It means that when he or she is not, it's because they accept the validity of the Ten Commandments, as I said earlier. And as many philosophers warn against, you cannot have cut flower ethics. Hitchens would like to take the beautiful values we get from religion, charity, generosity, goodness, faith, hope, etc., all those things that keep us going, all those things that have made someone like Barack Obama so popular in the United States, and he would like to say that we can have it without religion. It's like taking flowers, cutting them from their bed, their fertile soil, and believing they're going to last. Put them in a vase, and they'll die.
Rabbi Boteach, can I interrupt you, please? I have to... When I speak to my students about God, I invariably tell them, if anybody should say to you, do you believe in God? The only appropriate answer to that question is, tell me what you mean by God, and I'll tell you if I believe in that God or not. So, we are back to this question. Is this a New Yorker cartoon kind of God that sits in the sky in the clouds, an old man wrapped in a talit and a kaftan? Is it a Spinozistic God that we're talking about? Is it a God of the Jewish naturalist Mordechai Kaplan, the power that makes for salvation? Is it a Maimonidean God, knowledge, knowing itself? What is your image? What is it?
Say more about this?
What I want him to say more, and then I want you to say more.
I think you're in a minority on that point. I mean, I thought we've both answered that question. He's to the best of his ability.
I did not. Sorry, I did not hear an answer. I did not hear an answer, Rabbi Boteach.
For me, God is he who fills the infinite expanse of space. It is he who is the origin of life. It is he who is the absolute moral authority to determine what is right and what is wrong. God is he who hears my prayer when I cry out in moments of distress. God is he who looks after the helpless. And God is he who I am sometimes very angry at for failing to look after the helpless. The essence of Judaism is the word Yisrael, he who wrestles with God. God is also he with whom I have a relationship. I have a right to challenge God.
Rabbi, you asked for this. You asked for this.
I asked for this. Fine. If I ask for it, I will then interrupt it. And
you asked for white noise. You asked for white noise, and you got it.
I will then address a question to Mr. Hitchens. Though the burden of proof is on the faithful for the existence of God, do you believe there is a discovery that can cause a paradigm shift, maybe advances in neuroscience?
Well, all the evidence so far is the other way. I mean, the heavens get emptier, if you like, all the time. I think the unraveling of the DNA string is probably the most conclusive recent thing. It shows us both that racism, where Rabbi Shmuley and I at least agree, and creationism are alike illusions. We are part of the natural order. We're not a specially created species. We have no unique privilege. We are only too aware that Darwin was right on the point of the stamp of our lowly origins. It's best to begin, I think, from that realistic understanding, because bleak though it may be, at least it's realistic. It doesn't mean that we have to live without irony. It doesn't mean we have to live without humor. It doesn't mean we have to live without solidarity, or any of the other things that make life, A, bearable, and B, possible. You may or may not have noticed that Rabbi Boteach has been contradicting himself directly all evening. He began by saying that our good qualities, our heroic and noble and gentle and generous qualities, are innate in us. He's quite right in saying that. Yes, they are innate in us, or in most of us, those who aren't psycho or sociopathic. That is precisely the point. Religion borrows its morality from us, not we from religion. God is man-made. And I can very briefly underline this point and make it not just an assertion on my part by putting it in the form of a dialectical question. Name me, if you can, a noble action performed or a noble thought uttered by a believer in God that could not be uttered by a non-believer. Right? I've issued this challenge in innumerable places and spaces now. I've not yet had a response. I await one. There's another question that goes with it, a corollary question. Name a wicked action performed or a wicked thing said by someone purely because of their religious faith. You don't even have to blink before you've thought of one. I rest my case. Thank you.
One final question for Rabbi Boteach. Rabbi, why did God play favorites and make the Jews the chosen people?
Well, clearly because Christopher Hitchens likes us so much. In fact, this is one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of Judaism. It is one that Christopher Hitchens not only misunderstands, but destructively misportrays in his book. God never played favorites with the Jews. The word chosen, or goyim nesaticha, I have made you a light to the nations, is never a noun, it is a verb. It connotes an activity. You are chosen by God to spread the light of God and the laws of God to all the inhabitants of the earth, to tell them how they too are God's children, to tell them how they too matter, how they too are loved by God. That is why Judaism always insists on not converting people to our faith, because you do not upgrade when you become a Jew. We are the only nation on earth that exists on the non-copyright to truth held by our religion. Christopher Hitchens actually uses the concept of chosenness to, sadly, justify anti-Semitism. Quote, page 250. By claiming to be chosen in a special exclusive covenant with the Almighty, the Jews invited hatred and suspicion and evinced their own form of racism. So we're hated because we told the world that we're chosen. Well, my friends, the British sort of think they're chosen. I lived there for 11 years. They sing a song called Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the world. No one hated the British for that.
I believe it's the waves.
Hold on. Rules the waves.
Waves,
well, they
waves.
never really took the British and sort of gassed them or anything like that. The Japanese have a rising sun on their flag because they believe that they are the land of the rising sun. The sun rises for them. I don't see that there's any particular hatred of the Japanese for that belief. Marcus Garvey, I just filmed a television show in Jamaica with my family. Marcus Garvey founded Black Power in the 1920s with the famous motto, "Black is beautiful." I didn't see people segregating blacks because of that belief. On the contrary, they were hated well before it. They were hated for no reason at all. To say that Jews are hated for for a claim to chosenness is to justify the most pernicious hatred in the history of the world.
Okay, but let's go back to the liturgical formulation.
And as I said, God never chose us and never played favorites. It was not that you are sufficient and now make everybody like you, get everybody to emulate you, because your path is the only correct path. Going as far back as 900 years, the great Jewish philosopher Maimonides, who was considered the greatest Jewish mind of all time, said that Christianity serves a godly purpose as does Islam. He respected and admired Islam. He said the Jews could even pray in mosques because they don't worship any kind of image or any kind of icon. So God never chose the Jews as a form of favoritism. He gave us this incredible mission. One might even say that it's a humbling motif rather than something that breeds arrogance. It means that if we ever think for a moment that we're it, that we are the end, God made us the means to other ends, to make sure that we spread the knowledge of God.
So,
I should say that, I believe that we have to keep all these conversations decent and ethical and moral. And one of my major points throughout the night is, I don't care that Christopher Hitchens is an atheist. He has every right to be. And I respect all my atheist friends, and most people who know me know that probably most of my friends are atheists. My problem is when you distort, because I spend my time primarily among secular people. But when you distort and invent, and when you make statements like a claim to chosenness breeds anti-Semitism, no, the Jews should not be blamed for the hatred shown to them. We should never blame a victim. It's not a woman who dresses in a suggestive way that leads her to being raped, God forbid. It is hatred that leads to those things, and that's why God said in the Ten Commandments that we cannot kill, we cannot steal, we have to live by a moral code. And finally, it's the reason why in the most moral and greatest moral affirmation in the history of the world, God says in Genesis 2, He created every human being, regardless of religion, creed, color, or faith, or non-faith, in His indelible image.
And as a final note, I assume you mean his literally.
No, I don't mean it literally, because God has no gender.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Rabbi Boteach. Thank you, Mr. Hitchens. Thank you all.
What? Well, no, maybe they've heard enough of us. Maybe they've heard enough of us. Well then, I should hate to leave it like that, and since he's been so generous as to claim so many atheists among his friends, I should say that some of my worst enemies are Jews. And certainly those who didn't get the news, again rather discrepantly delivered. Either God did or did not make a covenant with the Jewish people. I think, of course, you're right in saying that he didn't, because there's no such person, and the events described in those books never took place. Israeli archaeology has conclusively shown that the books of Moses are falsehood and propaganda. It's a jolly good thing, because otherwise there would have been a covenant that said, you can kill everyone in Canaan and take your property, as long as you keep your covenant with me, and as long as you mark it in your flesh. Now, don't go saying that that was not part of that fictional religion while it was strong. And I ask again, what happened to the Amalekites? What happened to the Midianites if this fiction is all that it is? It's actually Lord Alfred Douglas who, I think, said in a famous nasty little poem, how odd of God to choose the Jews. To whom someone in Oxford replied, not odd of God, the goyim annoy him. But I will say that those who flirt with this kind of specialness, I mean, it's true that every nation, almost every nation, has a feeling that it's specially favored by the divine. Not a covenant at Mount Sinai, exactly, a location that's yet to be discovered. But let's say Joan of Arc or indeed Rule Britannia, a song that when I lived in England I refused to sing, precisely because, as most of my friends would decline, precisely because it did express a concept of racial and national superiority. And to say that it didn't earn English and British people dislike, that we're simply victims blaming ourselves if people don't like us for shouting out about our supremacy is absurd and self-pitying.
How could you compare dislike of the British to anti-Semitism?
I didn't.
This
you
is
did.
absurd.
I didn't, big boy.
This
you
is
did.
Absurd. This is absurd. How could you compare the British being unpopular to the Holocaust?
Who made the comparison?
No. You know.
Well, if the kippah fits, why don't you just wear it? Well, now,
I should be allowed to respond to what you said about the Amalekites and the Hittites.
Well, I'd have a...
I'm sorry? No, it's okay.
Okay.
I should be allowed to respond to this. You know, my friends,
I haven't got my trousers off yet.
I lived in Britain. I lived in Britain for 11 years, and it's a country that I came to love and admire. I had the great honor of being the rabbi at Oxford University, and I befriended people like Richard Dawkins, who became a dear friend. And in England till today, the statesman who is most respected is Winston Churchill. I think that's fair to say, statistically, popularity. He ordered the indiscriminate bombing of Dresden, Hamburg. These cities were obliterated 3 months before the war ended. In Dresden, 250,000 died. In Hamburg, 330,000 died. There were cyclones created by the fire bombs, winds 200 miles an hour from the fires. 4 months later, Harry S. Truman, who was voted our second most popular president of the 20th century, ordered the indiscriminate nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But this did not mean that these were immoral men. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was voted the most popular, the most effective of 20th century presidents. He participated in many of those decisions for the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians, including men, women, and children.
Rabbi Boteach, what does this have to do with God?
I'm sorry? I'm answering his thing about the Hittites. It's just that they felt that certain war measures sometimes call for very, very extreme measures that in any other context would be immoral. Judaism would never today allow the murder of Hittites, Amalekites. In fact, Christopher Hitchens said it was only done in the context of war at the time, and God specifically forbade it forever thereafter. In the same way we would never bomb a German city today or use a nuclear bomb against another nation. You know that... You know. Well, I don't think we would. If you believe the United States would nuke someone, then so be it. I don't believe we would. I should tell you that Christopher Hitchens writes in his book that rabbis debate whether the Palestinians are today the Amalekites, and that is why they ought to be, and debate that they should be expelled. Again, name a single mainstream rabbi. There's always fringes, and to the extent to which fringes are kept on the fringe, they could never, ever define the mainstream. Name any mainstream rabbi that would ever say that. In fact, every Orthodox Jew or anyone who's knowledgeable of the Torah here will know that we are not, that Amalek is a concept that we have no capacity to identify according to the Torah itself. We don't know who they are. It's an ethereal concept. So much so that when the Jews of Hebron, when Baruch Goldstein killed the Palestinians who were at prayer in their mosque, then the very next morning, Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, I was living in England, called it an abomination, as did virtually every other rabbi. My house was firebombed that night at Oxford. Till today, the police don't know by how. Thank God a Spanish au pair who lived with us saved our children's lives by putting it out. My wife and I were out. It was a Saturday night. It was the night after Purim, if you recall. I still got I called a press conference and I said that what Baruch Goldstein did to those Palestinians who are our brothers, who are equally God's children, is the highest disgrace that Judaism and Orthodox Jewry has faced in my lifetime. So let's never say that this is justified, and that's why, I mean, with all due respect, in my own opinion, if you're going to write a book, and you're a great scholar, and I love your writing most of the time, and if you're going to say that rabbis say this and this court said that, I really believe there ought to be a footnote or a name. Till today, and you're still not quoting a name, you're quoting a book about something, etc. There is no such thing as a high Jewish court in Halacha, by the way.
You would take perhaps the name of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the head of the National Religious Party, very much sought after Israeli politician.
Ladies and gentlemen, good night.
And also
you. Thank you.
And I direct you again.
Rabbi Boteach.
I direct you again to.
Hitchens.
I direct you again to Dr. Israel Shahak's essay, "The Significance of Baruch Goldstein." From now on, I'm sorry, I can only be polite to someone who has a receipt and a book. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
100 books.
100 books.
100 books.